All right, so today I'm going to try to do a few shorter form episodes on some of the smaller features, but significant ones nonetheless. Um, this first one's going to be on batching, and how to use batching with a consumer. Where this is handy is typically when you have a consumer that many messages are published. In this case, we're going to simulate that with like a routing slip completed. 99% of the time we get that routing slip completed. We don't have issues. And we want to say log that or update that in a database somewhere, or maybe write it out to Elasticsearch or some tool. But we want to do it in a way that we aren't flooding that system. If we were writing it to SQL, every one of those is an insert, every one is a database connection. And in reality, we could do that as a batch of like 10 or 15 at a time and significantly reduce the load on the database. So I kind of want to show how that works and show how it's supported. It isn't as automatic as everything else, but we'll get there and we'll see it work. And so let's get started. So if we remember the solution we have, which is on GitHub now, by the way, all the videos should have a link to that. So you're welcome to pull that code down and take a look at it. If we go into well, let's just kind of do the example workflow because I want to kind of show as well. I said I wasn't going to code offline, but I had to do this because I got tired of pasting into the UI. So I created a simple little client that is going to allow me to submit orders and accept them and get their status. And this is using the HTTP API. So we're still going through the browser. So we're still doing that full end-to-end workflow. But we're doing it in a way that I can do stuff a lot faster. So I have the services up and running, everything where we left it off before. I'm going to come over here to the client and I'm going to run that real quick. And I'm going to say, give me 10 orders. And so it's going to go out, it's going to create 10 orders, and you can see everything kind of flashing by on the right side. It's processing those out, it's talking to the warehouse, it's scheduling messages, and now you can see the results that have popped up. I've set the sample app so that every fourth order it submits an invalid payment type so that I at least get some exceptions, and then it just sort of sits there and waits until the status of those either result at faulted or completed. So I'm continually hitting that HTTP endpoint. If we look over here in the website, you can see it's getting a ton of requests for checking the order status. So we're sending that order status request through the saga back and forth. So yeah, this makes it a little easier than cutting and pasting in the UI, and hopefully it'll make it real easy to kind of send a real quick test. I can also just do one. If I just want to go in here and hit one, I can just say one, and it'll just send one order so I can kind of see that. I need to do two if I actually want one to pass, though, because the first one, mod 4, is always 0, so it's always going to be a faulted one. Be easy enough to change that pretty quick. You'll also see that the logging is cleaned up. So one of the things that it just frustrated me in some of the earlier sessions is the logging. That sample default logging is horrible. So I went ahead and I loaded CyrilLog. I added that to the project so that I actually get decent one-line logging instead of that multi-line nausea mess that comes out by default with ASP.NET's console outputter. So I put that in there. So the logging is going to be a lot cleaner now. We won't have as many blank lines. So hopefully that'll help as well. Other than that, I haven't done a whole lot. I just wanted to show that that console app is there. It's set up. It makes it real easy to submit orders. So now I don't have to use the Swagger UI. Of course, it's still there. I could still use it, and I could still take any of these GUIDs and query that. It's just I wanted to kind of change that up. So yeah, so we're going to talk about batching. So if we look in the log here of the service, we can see there's a lot of places where I get these routing slip activity completed events and routing slip completed events. And I was going to use those as an example of how we could move those to use batching so that we aren't constantly just, writing those out all the time. So what I want to do with that, and I'm going to kind of show the transition path of how we would have done that, because likely we would have built the consumer the first time. Then we said, wow, this is really hammering the database. We need to go and address this because we want to batch that up to reduce the load on our server for whatever reason. Perfectly reasonable request. So we're going to go and we're going to look at our application. We know that we have the routing slip event consumer. And that routing slip event consumer currently looks at 3 different events: routing slip completed, routing slip activity completed, routing slip faulted, and And each of those, it basically is just writing out to the log right now. But we've determined that the routing slip completed, since it happens most of the time, is causing issues on our system. Under high order volume, we get too many of these and it's creating pressure. So we want to break this out and turn it into a batch. Now, to do that, we're going to create a new consumer, because we're going to say we're just going to pull that one out. Let's say there's additional behavior in here for whatever reason, but we want to just pull that one out. We're going to create a new consumer called the routing slip batch event consumer. And in that, we are going to consume a batch of routing slip completed. So the batch type it isn't a valid message type, but it is a wrapper that lets us consume a batch of messages at one time. And so what we will get within the batch is we will get a context.message. And that message will have an array of consume contexts of routing slip completed. So when we do a batch of messages, transports aren't going to do this for us automatically. So what happens is we read multiple messages from the transport, and when we reach certain batch thresholds, MassTransit will deliver that to the consumer as a single batch of messages. Now those messages are all in flight, they're locked on the broker, so other consumers aren't going to receive them, but they are still sort of kind of hanging there. So what we want to do is say, okay, well now I'm going to process these as a batch. And in this case, because I'm still just going to write them out to the logger. And we'll just change this. And we can even use the same type. It doesn't really matter. We're going to just log them out, but we're going to log them out as a single batch now. So if log is there, we're going to say logger.log log information, and in this case we'll do something like tracking numbers. I mean, we could just do a loop through, but we're gonna do it a little differently here. We'll just say routing slips completed. We'll do this as a single batch. We'll call it tracking numbers, and we are going to say context.message.select, and let's get the message.tracking number out of the actual routing slip completed message. And let's just do a string.join of comma with those. Probably going to need an extra parenthesis. We'll break that up so we can see that on a single line. So we're going to log this as a batch. We're really just going to do one log message that says all these tracking numbers are there. Great. So now we're handling that as a batch. We have a routing slip batch event consumer. We're going to move that to routing slip consumers. And now we're going to configure it. Now, batching doesn't get picked up by the automatic consumer discovery, or at least I think it doesn't. I mean, we could find out pretty quick, but I don't think it does. But we need to go back to our other message, and we need to take this out because we know that this is too busy. It's too fast. It's too much content. So we're going to take that out because we don't want to log that anymore there. Okay, so now we've taken that out. We've put that there. If we were just to start this up right now, what would we have? Let's see. Okay, it looks like we have a submit order, routing slip event. We still have all the queues that we had before. Ooh, we have a new source routing slip batch event. Interesting. I wonder what that bound. So let's go look at our broker and see what we did, because honestly, I'm curious. Log into RabbitMQ. We'll see what's connected. It looks like we have in the queues, we created the routing slip batch event queue. Do we have any consumers on it? We have a consumer on it. Okay, so we have a consumer. It's going to handle 16 at a time. And that's its prefetch count. I don't think it's actually doing what we think it's doing. Because if we look at the bindings. Okay, so it is getting, oh, we see, here's the problem though. See, it's binding to MassTransit batch routing slip completed. So that's our first mistake. Because we allowed this to auto-register, it's bound to a message type that'll never get published. So let's work through this and figure this out. So let's go ahead and stop our service. We realized we made a mistake, so we're going to go fix this out. And one of the things we're going to have to do is, because we're using auto-discovery, I'm going to have to create another directory here. I'm going to call this batch consumers, because these aren't supported with auto-discovery. Now, that would be a great feature request to do later, but we're not going to do that here live while everybody's watching, because honestly, that would be a little insane. We're going to move this to batch consumers, and we're going to put this in a different namespace because our discovery is based on namespace. Hey, Albert, welcome to the show. So with the routing slip batch event consumer moved to a different namespace, we're going to prevent discovery of that, because if we look at our submit order consumer, this is the one we're using as the anchor for discovery for our service. So if we go to program main, we're automatically adding the consumers from that namespace. And now we don't want to do that because we know it's a batch consumer. It's something that we have to treat special. Now that we've done that, we can take our name formatter here. We can, so we took that out. And now we're probably going to have to go clean that up because MassTransit isn't going to clean that up for us. So we're going to go back out to RabbitMQ. We're going to unbind this exchange. We're going to have this routing slip batch event by itself. We're actually going to go back out to the exchanges and find that batch and delete it because we didn't mean to do that. So we're going to delete that exchange because that isn't a valid message type that's going to get out there. So we're going to clean that up. We're going to go back to our code. And now we're going to configure the batch by itself. So we're going to, configure endpoints is still going to configure everything else, but now we have to configure our batching. And we're going to do that by creating our own endpoint name. So we're going to say config.receiveEndpoint. At this point, we're defining it ourselves. We're going to say endpoint formatter.consumer, and we're going to call it the routing slip event batch event consumer. Yeah. So we're going to use the endpoint name formatter, so we still get the same endpoint name, but then we're going to configure this endpoint ourselves. So we aren't going to use a definition, or we aren't going to do anything else. And this is actually something we haven't done to date, is how do we actually just go define an endpoint beyond the discovery? But now I'm going to configure it for batches. So I'm going to say e.batch, and I'm going to specify the routing slip completed event. And I'm doing this from memory, so hopefully I'm doing it right. It is documented on the website, which I can bring up if I get stuck. And now I have a couple of different things to do. Well, first I'm going to specify the consumer, which the consumer factory is, I want to say I just passed the provider. Yes. Routing slip batch event consumer. And what is this? Argument type is not there. Consumer. So I'm trying to figure out which configuration, because I know I support an overload for it, but I'm trying to figure out which one it is. Routing slip batch event consumer, comma, routing slip completed. Did that work? Yeah. So apparently I have to define those generic types to get it to resolve from the container, which is fine. I'm okay with that. But I have to configure a few other things. So with a batch, there are two ways that a batch can be completed, by time or by count. So the first thing is the time limit. What is the time limit that I want to wait before my batch is reached? And because I don't really mind too much here, I'm going to say that it's going to be time span from seconds, and I'll say 5 seconds. If I don't receive enough messages to complete the batch in 5 seconds, I'll auto-complete the batch and deliver what I have to the consumer, which is going to be 1 or more messages. I'm also going to set the message limit. So how many messages do I want? Now this is an important parameter to think about, because if I set this too high, I'm always going to time out. because I'll never reach that message limit. And why that is because it's going to depend upon how many messages I'm preloading from the broker. So if I set this to 10, which would be a 10x reduction in the number of calls I'm making to my database server, I need to make sure that my prefetch count is at least 10. So I'm going to set it to 10 just so that they match. Ideally, I could set this to like 11, but that's really just something that you want to tune with. I could set it to 20 as well, so that it would preload and have batches always loaded, making it faster. It really doesn't matter. But it needs to be higher than the message limit, because otherwise you'll always get the timeout, and then your processing is going to be incredibly slow. And this timeout could be as low as 200 milliseconds. I mean, you don't need to make it huge, especially if it's a high volume of messages. You're really just trying to reduce the number of times you call the database server or whatever you're writing to. And even with a timeout of 100 milliseconds, that's 10 calls per second that you would make. One of the questions in the chat is, will it error if you do that? If I set this to 5, there are no errors. It will just always reach the time limit. It doesn't check to see if you've configured the transport properly. It just doesn't do that. It would be great if it did, but it doesn't. So I'm going to set that to 20. I'm going to set the message limit to 10. And I'll be surprised if I can get 10 of these in 5 seconds. I mean, it would really surprise me, actually. But I'm going to crank up the load and see what we get with the test client. So I've configured the batch. I've put it on the endpoint. I've told it I want routing slip completed, and I'm going to get that message. Okay, so we've configured that endpoint. Let's save this, check it out, and see if it runs. See if we get our batch endpoints. We can see we bound the queue, routing slip event, we bound the queue. What else do we have? Where is it? Consumer okay. Routing slip batch event, there it is. So our consumers are all loaded. This logging format is so much easier to read. I'm already loving it, I'm just gonna say. And now I'm gonna go to my test client, and I'm gonna, let's kick off 10 orders, see what happens. Okay, so our 10 orders ran. Every fourth one is faulted, just like we expected. We got a gnarly little error here. What is this error? Routing slip batch event. Unable to resolve consumer type routing slip batch event consumer. One of the questions in the chat is that the MassTransit logger. At the beginning of the thing, and for those that joined late, I added CyrilLog as the console output. I used the CyrilLog colored console output for this to replace the standard dependency, or whatever it is, the standard extensions logging console output. I replaced that with the CyrilLog output so that it's a lot cleaner to see. It's so much nicer. I mean, if we go to program CS in service, not that. Sample service. It's super easy to set up. You just add, I took this straight off the website. You set up the minimum level, you override some stuff, add that, and then you just do, I think it's in the configure logging. Yeah, you just say add CyrilLog, and you're done. It's so easy, so clean. And yeah, just so much nicer than the default logging of any type. So I got an error because this wasn't registered in the container. So since I'm not using add consumers from namespace containing, I need to come in here and say config.addConsumer. No, I don't want to say add consumer because I don't want it to be auto-discovered, but I do need to say services.addScoped and my consumer type so that it'll be created from the container. So now if I go out and run that again, well, it's still running. Let me go ahead and kill it. So if I run that again, should be up and running. Now if I go back and send 10 more messages, One, two, three, four, five, six. Oh yeah, and we received them, so we marked them as received. And you can see we got the routing slips completed message with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which we should have got because we had 7 completed. Yep, so we had 7 completed. So we hit the time limit because we only had 7 messages instead of 10. And then we waited and then we wrote those out. That's why it was 5 or so seconds afterwards. So the batching works, and we were able to resolve our consumer, and everything was great. So let's go look and see what that looks like on our broker now. So if we come out here and look, we have those error messages that we got the first time we ran it, the 7 errors. So I'm just going to purge those out because I don't want to see them anymore. I could shovel those back in, but it's too late. I already deleted them. But another thing that I'm concerned about is this, routing slip event skipped. So if we look, skipped has 14 messages in it. And what are those messages? Now, if I ran, math is pretty simple. 14 divided by 2 is 7, and that's how many I get each time I run it. But if I do a get and look, I'm still getting those routing slip completed events in my other consumer that no longer has a binding to it. So because there are no consumers on that endpoint, now these messages are being moved into the skipped queue because there isn't a consumer for them, so it moves them out. I'm going to go ahead and purge these because I don't want them in there. But I have to go out and manually clean that up because routing slip event no longer has a consumer for routing slip completed. So the binding was there because the consumer was there at one point, but since I've gotten rid of it, I need to unbind that. Now I won't get those skipped messages. So now if I go back out here, that is still running, and I did this while that was live. I mean, it's not a big deal. Now I'm going to do 20 messages. And, given that now I should actually see the routing slips completing in different things, I should see myself reaching that message limit for the routing slip tracking numbers. And I should have had 2 of them because I had 14 since I did 20, and it looks like I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in one batch. Let's go see if we can find the other batch up here somewhere. Yeah, and here's the other batch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we had 10 in that first batch. So you can see that those 2 batches were processed. If we go back to our queue, we can see that there's no skipped messages because we got rid of that binding. There are no error messages. Everything is good there. One of the questions in the chat. So is the same definition of skipped queue for earlier versions of MT? Yeah, it's always the same. If there aren't consumers for the message type, when the message is delivered to MassTransit on that endpoint, if it isn't consumed, it gets moved to skipped, same as before. And as we mentioned in the last episode, you can now actually configure it to discard skipped messages so that they aren't moved to the skipped queue. And that would be super easy to do on here. I would just say receive endpoint.discard faulted or discard skipped messages. So I could do either of those and turn off the error queue or turn off the skipped queue so that they don't process. So that's a couple of different things we've covered. How to configure your own receive endpoint, how to add a batch consumer. I did need to register it in the container because I can't use the auto discovery. And I can't, and I made sure that my prefetch count was higher than my message limit. If I had to set that lower, I would have just seen all of those timeout for each one. Like if I set this to 4 and then run this, and then I do, let's say 16 is going to get me 3 batches because every 4th one is going to fault. Yep, there was 1. And then the next batch will come up here because they're all going to time out because I'm only ever going to get 4 messages. And you can see there were 4 in that batch. If I go back up here where the previous one was, if I can find it. All the pretty colors, I'm telling you, it's pretty awesome. I probably went past it because it's just scrolling too fast. Oh yeah, here they are. Wow, okay, yeah, because the timeout was long enough, they actually did all 4 right at the end because they all had to time out. So all 4 of them timed out because that prefetch count was too low. So if you're seeing, gee, it seems like all of my timeouts are always being hit right after each other, it's because your prefetch count isn't high enough. So just by going and fixing that and setting that back to 20, it's going to resolve that problem. So that's batching. A couple little side things on how to clean up exchanges and recognize skipped messages. If I wanted to add the activity completed, which again, 99% of the time we're going to activity complete, although in my case, because every 4th one, it's 75% of the time. But for those cases where I just want to, handle it and get it done, I could move activity completed to the batch consumer as well, clean up the exchanges, and then take advantage of that as well. It would be different batch methods in the receive endpoint. So I would have to create a separate batch for routing slip activity completed. There isn't any auto discovery on consumers for that batch because you have to configure things like message limit and time limit. So that's the only reason I don't have any automatic discovery on that, is because there is additional configuration required. I could try to infer things, but that's kind of going into magic land that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So hopefully that was a good start. I'm probably going to do another couple episodes later today. I want to do one on message data, which is like large payloads, and probably one other on something. Depends. It's cold outside, the weather's terrible, and we're all trapped inside, so might as well make use of the time. So hope you enjoyed this, short and sweet, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks.